focused on cloud and colocation, data center industry trends, and dynamic market.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's Dan Scarborough here with Data Center Hawk. Excited to be with Matt Pullen, the EVP of Europe for CyrusOne today. Hello, Matt. Nice to see you.
Hi, Dan. Nice to see you too.
So, Matt, I'm hoping that everyone knows who you are and CyrusOne, but we've more than likely got a few people that don't. So could you just give a brief intro to you and CyrusOne?
Sure. Matthew Pullen, as you've mentioned. You also mentioned I'm an EVP at CyrusOne, and I am also the managing director of our European business. CyrusOne simply is the third largest US data center REIT, with a portfolio that spans the Americas and Europe that comprises circa 50 data centers. And in Europe, our growth has been pretty significant over the last few years. We're now at about 11 facilities that are either operational or about to be operational within the region.
So the market is definitely getting busier and changing since you started in the industry. I'm assuming probably longer than, or maybe at least around about the same time I did, should we say? But how would you describe Cyrus? How are you unique or different to some of the other operators that are out there?
So I think it's important to just focus on the point that we're a very large public company. We're a REIT, and therefore we've got access to a significant amount of capital at corporate level. And that's so important in this market when your customer base is largely hyperscale, because you need to often build at significant scale and at risk, and asset level financing or requirement for asset level financing gets in the way of that. So we're far more agile when it comes to our ability to get on and start to deliver capacity, on the curve or ahead of the curve for hyperscale. We put it out there that we have a very well organized and rationalized supply chain, and that's a global supply chain. That means that we're often able to build faster, particularly at scale, than a lot of the competition.
Okay, so from this conversation, I think we're focused on Europe, and the audience are always interested to kind of get the dynamics of different challenges and opportunities and what the different markets are like. And you're one of the operators that's active in all the flat markets. Can you just give us some insight into some of the differences you've seen operating in these locations, some of the challenges that you're seeing, power availability, land price, planning, customer interest, etc.? Just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, sure. And we need to put it in the context that last year we saw 300 megawatts of headline signings in the flat D markets, which was extraordinary, nearly a 50% increase on the year before. So, I mean, the pace in these markets is quite extraordinary. Save the demand is not uniform across the markets. As you're driving at, there are big differences. So, we've seen London and Frankfurt power on. Last year, Frankfurt had the most take up from a headline signings point of view in absolute terms, followed by London. But the highest growth market last year was Paris, coming off a much lower base in terms of market size from a supply point of view than London and Frankfurt. Dublin traditionally has been a self-build market, very, very small colo market. Certainly, relatively tiny take-up statistics every year when compared to a London or a Frankfurt. If you're thinking London or Frankfurt might be 70 to 90 megawatts a year, Dublin would be in the 10 to 15 range. But because of the pandemic, what we saw is just a surge in demand for online services. And bearing in mind, Dublin is a mega cluster for a lot of the hyperscale companies. It caught them off guard, and I think what you'll see coming through this year is what appears to be, a pivot in terms of scale of headline signings in Dublin, but it's largely because there was some colo capacity that has been able to infill for the hyperscalers. Between the delivery of their current self-builds and the next phase of self-builds. Amsterdam's been interesting. It's important to point out that Amsterdam is not a region for all of the big hyperscalers. It's in fact only a region for one of the big hyperscalers. And whilst it's had a fairly healthy enterprise market, you just don't see the big takedowns in Amsterdam. You do see self-build, but that's all driven by different dynamics. Challenges, well, COVID's been a challenge, full stop, as you can imagine. The good thing is in the flat D markets that the governments have generally recognised what we're doing and what the industry is doing as either essential or critical, and therefore we've been helped from a mobility point of view and helped in terms of keeping construction sites open. It was only the Irish government that shut construction for a short period of time, about 8 weeks a year ago, but in the latest waves, data center construction has been allowed to continue. I guess the most notable frustration has been permitting, in the sense that the pandemic meant, quite rightly, that some leave was given to government organisations in terms of any timelines to deliver permits. So we've seen the time to secure permits in France and Germany particularly move out to time periods that have been very challenging for everybody, I'd say.
Interesting. And so in terms of just coming back to the Amsterdam side of things, have you seen the moratorium over there, or let's say Brexit, and the UK? Have you seen any of these other external factors impacting kind of demand and supply in those two locations?
I think Brexit's been of benefit to the London market. I think there was a slight stall due to a bit of uncertainty over what was going to happen, but we've seen the market push on, and we're seeing some evidence of that again this year in the statistics as they come through. But it's all about data sovereignty. There's clearly a view and a need from the hyperscalers that they need to bulk up in the UK to deal with any data sovereignty issues that they didn't face pre-Brexit. In terms of the moratorium in the Netherlands and in Amsterdam in particular, that issue was resolved, and so there is clarity on where data centers can be built. And fortunately, we were building and have development land in an area that is supported by the government for continued data center use and development. And so therefore, I don't think that has been really a big deal for the Amsterdam market. I think it's more understanding the underlying, the bedrock dynamics of that market more than anything.
Okay, so I know we've spoken before a couple of times around the kind of tier 1 and tier versus tier 2 locations, and I was interested in your take on the demand in tier 2 versus tier 1 locations, if you would kind of maybe take us through that, and also what your thoughts are on expanding outside of the flat markets for Cyrus.
Yeah, sure. I think it's dangerous to use tier 1, tier 2 sort of talk in a way, because if you move into the hyperscale world, and bearing in mind that so much demand is driven by the hyperscale companies, then really what we're talking about is a market, a region for the hyperscalers or not. And if it's a region, they serve the market from within that market, and their demand is significant for physical capacity in the markets. And if it's not a region, they are serving the market, they will serve it through edge nodes, and their demand will be a fraction of what it would be if it was a region. So what you're seeing is you're just seeing the hyperscalers sort of move through Europe, opening up regions as they go. And of course, everyone's in pursuit of GDP. So it's no surprise that the biggest markets in terms of GDP were the first regions, but gradually in the hyperscalers are pushing through and opening regions across Europe. And the dynamic that I really like is when you look at how some of those markets that are becoming new regions, how they've developed or haven't developed through the last two iterations of the data center market. If you take the first as the telco boom, 98 to 2001, and then the second as the enterprise boom, post 9/11, up until the hyperscale iteration of the market that really started in 2014. Now, you have a number of markets that had a lot of colo capacity delivered in the telco market, in the telco boom, but then didn't grow in the enterprise phase, mainly because of classic cultural barriers to outsourcing. Spain being a fantastic example, France being a good example too, where during the enterprise phase in the US, in the UK, and some other parts of Northern Europe, you saw the big banks who were being forced by regulation to diversify their data center platforms, leading to quite a lot of demand for colo. You saw them push platforms into co-location facilities, whereas in Southern Europe and the countries that are more culturally opposed to outsourcing, you saw the big banks build their own data centers, and therefore the colo markets didn't expand. So we now find ourselves in an interesting situation, which is that really the digital economy is, I always say this, is transcending traditional barriers to outsourcing, and you're seeing exponential demand in markets where they've got a tiny basis of supply. And you think about a market like London, which is now pushing 800 megawatts. Up until Madrid, for example, became a region, you could say that market only had 50 to 60 megawatts of supply. And then all of a sudden you're seeing the markets doubling in size. And it's fantastic. It's such an opportunity. And that's why you're seeing a lot of new capital looking at potentially bypassing what you would call the tier one markets because of the level of competition and the fact that land prices, and we haven't talked about this, land prices have increased significantly and power delivery timelines have gone out significantly. They're bypassing and they're going to the new, and I'd call them not tier two, but I'd call them the new regions for the hyperscalers, be it Madrid, Milan, Warsaw, Vienna, etc.
And I mean, if you look at the capacity in London, even though it's developed over a longer period of time, if you were to put your crystal ball on and you looked at something like Madrid, is that going to be at the same level, or is that, I mean, is London going to plateau and there's a catch up, or is there continually going to be that gap, or what do you think? How much will that demand in a location like Madrid increase over the next 5 years, say?
Well, I mean, if you think we've talked about it in absolute terms, the London colo market's 750, 800 megawatts. Hyperscale deployments as at the end of last year had reached 285, 300 megawatts.
Right.
And in Frankfurt's now not far behind. In the mid 200s. Paris saw significant growth, but even by the end of last year, Paris was still only at about 130 megawatts of hyperscale deployment. So if you like, you've got to put everything relative to GDP. So Madrid's growth will be proportionate to its GDP comparison between, Madrid and London. Yeah. And that's assuming that I'm right in terms of traditional barriers to outsourcing being, transcended by the digital economy. And because let's face it, the surge is going to be off the back of increased enterprise outsourcing to the cloud. So you should see Madrid push on quite significantly from its current base. And its current base is simply that a number of hyperscalers have gone in, they've done their traditional 3 availability zone deployments at maybe 4.5 megawatts in each AZ. And they will scale from there. But, it's going to be, I would say, some time before you see the hyperscalers increasing at the sort of rate you see in a mature market like London and Frankfurt at maybe 10 megawatts per AZ per year. It's going to be more like, a megawatt, 2 megawatts per AZ,
Well, I
or
suppose
per facility per AZ per year.
so that brings me on to kind of my next question. If you look at the edge market, 5G autonomous vehicles, you know, I mean, I don't know whether I believe it or not, but according to some of the analysts, they're saying that a significant amount of the data will reside at the edge and isn't ever going to see the data center. You know, so what do you have an edge strategy? I know some of the operators I've been talking to have been looking at that as an extension of their product offering. And what's your take on that side of things?
To be honest, I'd really love to know what the answer is around the edge, because everybody got extremely excited about it, you know, going back 2 years, that it was going to be the thing, and you know, there'd be data centers under every lamppost in every country, and then there'd be, you know, aggregation data centers, blah blah blah. The reality has been that actually, whilst the physical networks are not necessarily as underdeveloped as they are, because they're not, they're maturing, but whilst they're configured the way that they are, even if you're very close or think you are very close to your end customer, you may well not be, because of the routing of traffic on the infrastructure. So look, I get the whole point around 5G, etc., and you know, we've seen it in continents like Africa, where technology just jumps over, you know, sometimes decades of legacy infrastructure development. But I think the story on the edge is not clear yet, and won't be for at least a few years. And I don't know whether it's going to be autonomous car technology that will eventually sort of help clarify what everybody's opportunity is, and therefore strategy should be. But right now, I don't see clarity, and we don't have, quite consciously, we haven't got a defined edge strategy. You know, our focus is on, you know, building at scale, increasing the number of markets to support the hyperscalers, and as edge becomes clearer, we might pivot to some form of strategy.
So next point is around sustainability. Clearly, that seems to be a very important topic that everyone's talking about with various different industry commitments. Can you just, you know, talk to me about your approach to sustainability as a business, and how that's changing the way that you operate as a company in light of, you know, these zero carbon by 2040 target that you have you put out in your sustainability report?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. We've said we'll be carbon neutral by 2040. I think, Dan, the point is that everybody has to embrace sustainability and have it at the heart of their strategy, because at the end of the day, if we're not careful, we're going to be regulated in a completely inappropriate way. And also, what we have to do is we have to acknowledge that our customers are some of the, in the odd case, biggest companies in the world. And, you know, if they don't keep pace with their commitments to be sustainable, you know, their businesses are going to suffer, and therefore will suffer. So we're in this together. But I think it's the regulatory issue that is of most concern, and that, you know, that's why we've signed up through our membership of the EU DCA to the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact. You know, us and another 30 odd operators, together with the hyperscalers, are effectively going to be putting forward to Brussels the idea of self-regulation, because what we're finding is that there is still really limited understanding of the data center industry and the issues that we face in terms of how we have to run data centers to support the growth in the global economy, and the fact that they need to follow GDP and be in urban and suburban locations. And so it's really important that we try and, you know, own our own destiny. And at the same time, what we're doing is asking Brussels to consider the fact that they really have to help us, you know, because we can't consume renewable energy if the member states aren't thinking about a strategy for giving us access to enough renewable energy to be able to meet targets. So really, really important.
Do you feel that it's coming through in your customer discussions as well, that your clients are, when they're talking about RFPs and talking about their next developments that they're doing with you, that sustainability is a big part of that conversation, or has that yet to come through? Are they still keen on getting things built as quickly as they possibly can on budget and within the right, deliverables for their business? How important is sustainability as a priority for them?
It's important. You touched on something just then, which is the problem that the industry's got, is that it's tough to build this stuff quick enough for demand at the moment. So there is naturally a focus on making sure first off capacity is available, but there is no question that sustainability has come, through the front door in discussions. Not least because, and sorry to make it a commercial, the answer again is that, at the end of the day, we're seeing unprecedented utilization of data center capacity. In the enterprise period, you were lucky if your data center saw 40 to 50% utilization. That was considered to be high utilization. We have customers who will be running close to 100% utilization. And so the point being that for them, efficiency is really, really important, because, the cost of operating within an inefficient data center is significantly more than an efficient data center. But then they also have a lot of their own corporate targets. And so outside of the basics of PUE and water utilization efficiency, they are really focused on the circular economy. And, for instance, we often are required to agree to put in place pilot studies on new big agreements, particularly around waste management and things like that. So yeah, it's ever present.
That's interesting. And from a technology perspective, I was going to kind of talk to you about immersive cooling and some of the density changes that you're seeing. I mean, I know that the rack densities 10 years ago, were what, sort of 2 to 3 kilowatts of rack, pretty high, right? I mean, what density are you getting up to? And are you seeing immersive cooling being adopted at your sites, or what are you seeing in terms of the density and how
yeah. I mean, it's been sort of 7.5 kilowatts a rack for a while. It's now moving to 12.5 kilowatts a rack, and so the densities are going up. The summers aren't getting any cooler, so yeah, it's putting a bit of stress on just cooling efficiency, and the need to find some solutions. The one big issue that everyone wants to really grapple with is starting to look at operating data centers at higher temperatures, is moving away from the traditional SLAs that whatever it might be, 18 to 27 degrees, and pushing that to 30 degrees so that we're using less energy to cool, frankly. And that's going to be a big piece of the discussions with Brussels around whether or not we need a bit of, whilst we want to self-regulate, do we need a bit of help to start saying, well, yeah, governments are happy that regulations enable data centers to run at slightly higher temperatures. But there's all debate around different types of cooling and pilot projects here, there, and everywhere. But I still think we're grappling with the fundamental point that I just mentioned, which is these things kick off an awful lot of heat, but technology is enabling equipment to operate at higher temperatures. And if we can see the industry standards move to accommodate the norm being operating at higher temperatures, we're going to consume less energy.
Yeah, I suppose that kind of my thought process is around, if you remember the mobile phones, when you had these huge bricks with the car, and is the data center going to become a bit like the mobile phone, where at some point in the future you'll have these small real estate footprint, immersed cooled data centers that are a megawatt plus in a very small, footprint. Is that something that you see coming, and how would that impact a real estate investment trust? I'm assuming the cost per square foot would go up, or it's something that you would manage that as part of your financial structure as well.
Yeah, I don't think there's no notion that we're going to go to miniaturized data centers anytime soon, because it's physics, isn't it? It's about how do you move the heat, and you need space to be able to move the heat away. I'm no stellar engineer, but I can't see it happening quickly. The other thing is, of course, that the big customers, they're buying their equipment on timelines that mean that it's going to take some time for
transition to happen.
but we've been talking about this since God knows when. I mean, I haven't been talking about it since the 70s because I was still in shorts then, but certainly from the mid 90s we've been talking about this, and Moore's law, and the fact that you're going to have a data center that fits in your wallet. Well, it's not it's not happened in my lifetime. But I mean, the one thing that has happened of late is you can see the stress that's being put on traditional designs by the increase in density, and more to the point, the increase in utilization, which, as I said to you before, I've never seen anything like it in my life.
No, that's crazy. That sort of 100% utilization is that, and that's at the power level, I'm assuming, on the physical.
Yeah.
So my last question for you, and again, I thought this was something that we covered previously that was quite interesting. Do you think the data center construction, in terms of bringing on board, new capacity, and you look at the various different organizations that are building out in all sorts of different locations and are planning kind of these investments on an annualized basis into the future, do you think that marries to the customer requirements, or do you think those things are a bit out of sync in terms of the amount of capacity that's being built versus the amount of demand that we're going to see? Are they in line, or are they out of sync?
I could think about what message I want to give to new entrants in competition. No, I don't think they're out of sync. Dan, you've been around this industry a long time, and I think the point to make, and when we've talked about some of the data, is that this is still a tiny industry. I mean, you think that the London data center market, in terms of footprint, is still only not a few million. It's more than the 3 million square feet it was 10 years ago, but it's still, whatever we want to say, it's probably, in the colo terms, it's 5 to 6, maybe 7 million square feet. When you think the city of London has close to 100 million, or probably more, just the city of London in terms of square feet of office, 100 million plus. And so we've got to keep putting it into perspective that we're still a very small industry. So no, I think that the supply is coming through to meet the demand. I think everybody got caught off guard because of the surge in demand, naturally, as a result of the pandemic, but people are reacting, capacity is coming through. I think it's much more about the fact that the hyperscalers forward buy demand. So, when they're signing for 20 megawatts, they're not signing for 20 megawatts that they're going to immediately utilize. They're usually buying for, let's say, 3 years. So it's quite a complex dynamic to, look at each market, and we do this all the time. You're sitting in a market, you're looking at your own development pipeline, you're looking at the competition, and you're never concerned, particularly in the key markets, that you are somehow going to be left with a white elephant. Not at all, because the demand curve is sustainable. It's more, is your timing right to ensure that you're going to get your hands on revenue recognition early, or are you going to get caught up in a wave of competing supply, which could lead to price dilution? It could lead to a number of things, but ultimately it could lead to a void that you weren't really expecting. It's much more about that. It's just trying to anticipate when the buying cycles are going to come through from each hyperscaler and what the quantum of that buying cycle will be.
No, it's interesting. I think it's true what you're saying about the relatively young nature of the industry and that maturity curve that we're going through. It's been interesting to see the changes over the last 10 years or so. Matt, thank you for your time. It's been very interesting, and hopefully the audience has got some insight, and we'd love to stay in touch with you over the coming years and see what you guys are up to and how things progress.
Always. No, it's lovely to see you, Dan. So we've known each other for a long time. Let's hope that continues. Thank you.